Asteroid City is the most Wes Anderson film that Wes Anderson has ever made, so let's talk about it. As always, this video will have spoilers, so if you don't want spoilers, head over to my shorts or my TikTok and check out my one-take movie review on this movie. But without further ado, let's talk about Asteroid City. Now it's clear to see that Wes Anderson had his hands all over this film, and I like his style, but in my opinion, this isn't his best movie. It did have some good in it, but the story was pretty tough to follow, so let's get into what this movie is about. So in this movie, we see the events of a town called Asteroid City play out during their junior space cadet convention. But that all stops when an alien comes to town and interrupts everything. Starting off with the good, and this is no surprise for a Wes Anderson film, but the cinematography was great. This movie had its problems in my opinion, but this was not one of them. Every shot in this movie had Wes Anderson written all over it. They were centered, symmetrical, and just overall aesthetically pleasing to look at. I also really like the camera movements in this movie. Now, Wes Anderson doesn't have complicated camera movements. It's essentially just a bunch of tilts, pans, and quick zooms in. But the way he uses those in his movies to kind of set the overall tone is just really creative and just really interesting to me. And that kind of leads me into the next good thing about this movie, kind of going off of the cinematography, and that is the visuals. Now, this is one of those movies that I could honestly just stare at, and that's not just because of the creative shots that Wes Anderson was getting, but it's also because of the colors and the set design, which is absolutely beautiful in this movie. But apparently, I guess they went to the middle of the desert in Spain and built out this whole town of Asteroid City, and it just looked really cool overall, because it was just them in the middle of the desert, so I guess that kind of allowed them to do whatever they want out there. So whoever the set designer was for this movie, round of applause to you, because you made a really cool looking town in Asteroid City. And finally, for the good, I have Scarlett Johansson and Jason Schwartzman. Now, these two were easily the standouts of this film. Their two characters had a bit of a love story going on, and overall, they just had really good chemistry together. Their scenes were easily the most intriguing in this entire movie, and out of all the characters in this movie, they were probably really the only two that were really fleshed out and explored. And that probably explains why they were the only two characters that I genuinely cared about in this movie outside of their kids. Now, I thought the whole cast did well in their roles, but it was clear to me that Scarlett Johansson and Jason Schwartzman were just easily the standouts in this movie. They had some of the best scenes, as I said before, and they were just really one of my favorite parts of this entire film. And next, let's get into the so-so, and here I have the story, and that is because this movie was pretty hard to follow at some points. So essentially, Asteroid City was just a play happening inside this movie, and you kind of flipped back and forth between that and a black and white reenactment of how this play was made. And overall, there was really no singular plot of this movie. You kind of just sat there and watched a series of events unfold. And I know they kind of addressed this at the end of the movie where they said something along the lines of, if the story doesn't make sense, then just keep telling the story. So hey, maybe that was the point and this was done on purpose for the story not to make sense and there not to be much of a story in this movie. But because of that, it just felt for me that it was hard to really get invested in this movie. And finally, let's get into the bad. And first up for the bad, I have that there were lots of characters in this movie, and I think this is one of the reasons why the story was kind of tough to follow and didn't really make sense, because we were juggling between all these characters. I just felt we didn't get to spend enough time with all of the characters, and honestly, outside of Jason Schwartzman's character and Scarlett Johansson's character and their kids, I couldn't tell you a whole lot about the other characters in this movie, and that's a shame because they were played by really talented actors who did good in their role. I just wish we could have spent a little bit more time with them. And because we didn't get to spend a lot of time with them, it just kind of felt like they were there at some points in this movie and didn't have much to do. And next up for the bad, and I'd probably be lying to you if I didn't tell you this, and this may just be a me thing, but at some points in this movie, it was pretty boring. Now, don't get me wrong, there were some parts of this film that I genuinely enjoyed, but because there wasn't a central story and it was kind of tough to make sense of the story in this film, there were some parts that got pretty boring. And this is really more in the beginning for me, as I felt like nothing really happened until we got to the scene where the alien showed up about halfway through the movie. And I thought that was a real turning point in this movie, as it did get a little bit better after that. But in the beginning of this movie, that first half, as I said before, I'd be lying to you if I said that I was 100% engaged through the first half of the movie, because there were some parts that I was pretty bored of. And finally, for the bad, I have the black and white reenactment scenes. Now, I understand what they were going for in showing these scenes, but I wish we would have just gotten more of Asteroid City, because when it came to the Asteroid City scenes, I think those contained some of the more better parts of the movie. And it just felt like the movie stopped once we got to those black and white scenes, and I was just waiting to get back to Asteroid City. And honestly, that's probably why I was a little bored in the first half of this movie, because they did have more of those black and white reenactment scenes in the first half than they did the second half. But when I'm talking about these black and white scenes, I am not including the scene with Margot Robbie there at the end, because in my opinion, that was one of the best scenes of this entire movie. But overall, Asteroid City is just okay. It has Wes Anderson's classic style, which is something I enjoyed, and visually this movie looks great. But outside of Scarlett Johansson and Jason Schwartzman, this movie didn't have much to offer in my opinion. It's by no means a bad movie, but it's definitely not one of Wes Anderson's best. Those are my thoughts on Asteroid City. Be sure to let me know what you thought of the movie down in the comments, and as always, be sure to like, subscribe, comment, get your Eazy Apparel at shop easyapparel.com. God bless, and I'll see you guys later. Peace.